Have you ever noticed how we've been conditioned to distrust the very thing that keeps us alive? There's something peculiar about the way we relate to our own bodies, isn't there? We speak of giving in to hunger, of resisting desire, of controlling our instincts. The language itself reveals a battlefield where we're somehow both the aggressor and the victim. Think about it. When was the last time you felt a powerful desire and your first reaction was complete acceptance? For most of us, that moment is followed by a familiar voice of judgment. Should I really want this? Is this appropriate? What would others think? It's as if we're constantly at war with ourselves, distrusting the very signals that have guided human survival for millennia. But what if this inner conflict isn't natural at all? What if it's the product of a profound historical mistake, a philosophical and religious error that has twisted our relationship with our own nature? What if your desires aren't the enemy, but rather the voice of life itself speaking through you? This isn't just about sensual pleasures or basic appetites. This extends to your curiosity, your creativity, your ambition, your longing for connection. These instinctive pulls that we so often question, suppress, or apologize for, what if they're actually nature's intelligence in motion? The irony is striking. We trust our bodies implicitly when they tell us to breathe, when our hearts pump blood, when our immune systems fight infection. Yet when those same bodies express desire or aversion, suddenly we believe we know better. We impose abstract moral codes and social conventions that often contradict our deepest instincts. We pride ourselves on this contradiction, calling it civilization, calling it morality, calling it being good. But at what cost? Look around. We see rising rates of anxiety, depression, and disconnection. We see people living lives of quiet desperation, following paths that bring little joy, making choices based on external approval rather than internal wisdom. We celebrate those who push through the pain, who deny themselves pleasure in pursuit of distant goals, who sacrifice authentic expression for social acceptance. What if this celebrated self-denial isn't wisdom at all, but a profound misunderstanding of human nature? What if our bodies don't lie, and our abstract beliefs often do? This question didn't come to me in a moment of clarity. It emerged slowly as I noticed a pattern. The moments when I trusted my instincts often led to growth, connection, and fulfillment, while the times I denied them in favor of should and must frequently led to resentment and emptiness. And I'm not alone in this observation. There was one thinker who saw this pattern with extraordinary clarity, who dedicated his life to exposing what he called the greatest error in human history, the war against our own nature. A philosopher whose ideas were so threatening to conventional morality that they've been systematically misrepresented for over a century. A man who found, in the wisdom of the body, a path to human flourishing that challenges everything we've been taught. Have you ever considered that your instincts might be wiser than your beliefs? That your body might know something your mind has forgotten? There's a curious disconnect in our approach to human desire that becomes apparent when we examine it closely. We've created a civilization that systematically teaches us to distrust the very forces that create and sustain life. From childhood, we're trained to override our natural inclinations. Sit still when you want to run, remain silent when you feel the urge to speak, deny hunger until an appropriate time, suppress anger, hide tears, control desire. We call this process civilization or maturity, but rarely do we question its underlying assumption that our instincts are fundamentally dangerous or flawed. This anomaly becomes even more striking when we look at how we treat other living creatures. We would never expect a lion to deny its predatory nature or criticize a bird for building a nest. We recognize that animals function perfectly by following their instincts. Yet somehow we've convinced ourselves that human instincts alone are suspect, that they must be controlled, suppressed, or overcome. The contradiction deepens when we consider how we treat the physical body in other contexts. Modern medicine respects the body's intelligence in healing wounds, fighting infections, maintaining temperature. We trust the body's wisdom when it comes to automatic processes like breathing or circulation. Yet when that same body generates desire, aversion, or emotional responses, suddenly we believe it needs to be overridden by rational thought or moral principles. What's particularly revealing is how this distrust of instinct intensifies precisely around the experiences most central to human flourishing. Sexual desire, dangerous. Hunger for rich foods, indulgent, anger at mistreatment, inappropriate, grief that demands expression, excessive, the drive for play and leisure, lazy, the very instincts that connect us to pleasure, protect our boundaries, process our losses, and restore our energy are the ones we're most taught to question and control. This pattern suggests something more than coincidence. It points to a systematic devaluation of embodied wisdom in favor of abstract principles. And this devaluation has consequences. Studies consistently show rising rates of anxiety, depression, and disconnection from purpose. We see increasing numbers of people who don't know what they want, who can't trust their own feelings, who look to external sources, social media, authorities, peer groups, to tell them what to desire, what to pursue, what to value. Consider the modern phenomenon of decision fatigue. Why do so many people struggle with even simple choices? Perhaps because they've been trained to disconnect from the internal compass that naturally guides such decisions. When you're taught that your instinctive responses are suspect, you lose access to the wisdom they contain. You become dependent on external validation and instruction. Even more telling is how we elevate those who demonstrate extreme control over their bodies. The athlete who pushes through the pain, the entrepreneur who sacrifices sleep, the ascetic who denies hunger. These figures are celebrated not just for their achievements, but specifically for their ability to override their instincts. We've created cultural heroes out of those who most effectively wage war against their own nature. But what if this entire framework is based on a fundamental misunderstanding? What if the glorified battle against instinct is actually a battle against our own flourishing? What if the wisdom of the body isn't something to overcome, but something to reclaim? Have you ever wondered what life might be like if you didn't have to constantly fight against your own nature? If instead of suppressing your instincts, you learned to listen to them with nuance and clarity? The year is 1879. In a modest room in Basel, Switzerland, a 35-year-old professor of philology sits at his desk, suffering from debilitating migraines, nausea, and failing eyesight. The pain is so severe that he can write only in short bursts, dictating much of his work during brief periods of relief. His academic career is effectively over. His health has forced him to resign his position. Most of his published works have been met with indifference or hostility. By conventional standards, this is a man at the end of his road, not the beginning. This is Friedrich Nietzsche at his lowest point physically. Yet it's precisely here, in this crucible of physical suffering, that his most revolutionary insights begin to crystallize. For a decade, he had been trained in the rigorous philological tradition, analyzing ancient texts and linguistic patterns. He had absorbed the philosophical tradition of the West, from Plato to Kant. He had immersed himself in the pessimistic philosophy of Schopenhauer, who viewed the will, our instinctive nature, as the source of all suffering. But something transformative was happening to Nietzsche through his illness. The experience of extreme physical distress was teaching him something that academic philosophy could not. As he would later write, "I doubt that such pain improves us, but I know that it deepens us." This deepening led Nietzsche to a profound realization. His own body, which seemed to be betraying him with constant pain, was actually speaking to him. His symptoms were not random afflictions, but communications, signals that the life he had been living, the scholar's life of pure intellect disconnected from physical vitality, was not sustainable for his particular constitution. Nietzsche began to experiment with his diet, his daily routines, his environment. He discovered that certain foods worsened his condition while others improved it. He found that his body functioned better in certain climates, at certain altitudes. Far from arbitrary preferences, these were specific wisdoms emerging from his physical nature. And as he learned to listen to these signals, rather than dismissing or overriding them, his health gradually improved. This personal experience opened Nietzsche's eyes to a broader philosophical insight. What if the West's entire tradition of morality and metaphysics was built on a profound error, the error of distrusting the body and its instinctive wisdom? What if, contrary to Plato, Kant, and Christianity, truth wasn't found by transcending the physical, but by returning to it with greater awareness? In his personal notebooks from this period, Nietzsche made a striking declaration: "I am writing this with my blood." It wasn't just a poetic flourish. He meant that his philosophy wasn't emerging from abstract reasoning alone. but from lived, embodied experience. He was learning through his own suffering what no amount of book learning could teach him: that the body has its own intelligence, that instinct carries wisdom that rational thought often misses. This insight set Nietzsche on a collision course with the entire Western philosophical and religious tradition, from Socrates, who claimed that the body was the prison of the soul, to Christianity's suspicion of the flesh as the source of sin, to Kant's elevation of abstract duty over natural inclination. The dominant intellectual current of Western culture had consistently devalued instinct in favor of reason, nature in favor of spirit, desire in favor of duty. Nietzsche came to see this devaluation as the greatest error in human history, a wrong turn in our collective understanding that had produced profound consequences. Our war against our own nature, he believed, was the underlying cause of what he diagnosed as modern nihilism: the creeping sense of meaninglessness, the decline of vitality, the inability to create new values. What made Nietzsche uniquely equipped to recognize this error? Perhaps it was precisely his intimate experience with physical suffering, which forced him to confront the reality of embodied existence in a way that healthy philosophers could more easily ignore. Perhaps it was his philological training, which allowed him to trace the linguistic and conceptual development of this error through historical texts. Or perhaps it was simply his extraordinary intellectual courage, his willingness to question even the most fundamental assumptions of his culture. Have you ever considered how your own physical experiences might contain wisdom that your rational mind can't access alone? Nietzsche's investigation began with a simple but profound observation. Throughout history, the philosophers and religious leaders most hostile to instinct were often those most detached from physical vitality. In Twilight of the Idols, he examines the case of Socrates, traditionally venerated as the father of Western rational philosophy. Nietzsche notes something others had overlooked. Socrates' famous dictum, "Knowledge is virtue," wasn't a universal truth but a personal solution to a specific problem. With Socrates, he writes, Greek taste undergoes a change in favor of dialectics. What is really happening when that happens? It is above all the defeat of a nobler taste. What did Nietzsche mean by this? He had discovered through his philological work that before Socrates, the Greek aristocratic culture celebrated instinct, physical excellence, and natural vitality. The heroes of Homer didn't deliberate endlessly about the right action. They knew it in their bodies, in what the Greeks called thymos, spiritedness. Socrates, with his emphasis on rational dialogue as the path to virtue, wasn't advancing philosophy, but responding to his own personal inability to access this instinctive wisdom. Nietzsche uncovered a pattern. Time and again, those who mistrusted instinct most deeply were often those whose instincts were, in his words, in anarchy, either excessive or deficient. He writes in The Gay Science that the condemnation of instincts is itself merely an instinct, specifically the instinct of the physiologically botched, those whose bodies don't function harmoniously. This insight led Nietzsche to a radical reframing of moral systems. What if moralities weren't universal truths, but rather sign languages of the emotions? What if the moral codes that had dominated Western civilization were primarily expressions of particular physical constitutions? Specifically, constitutions in which instinct was experienced as threatening rather than guiding. Consider Christianity's emphasis on controlling desire, denying the flesh, and suppressing natural impulses. Nietzsche saw this not as divine wisdom, but as the expression of a particular type of physical constitution, one that experienced its own instincts as overwhelming or dangerous, and therefore needed to control them through rigid moral frameworks. In On the Genealogy of Morals, he writes, "There is no being behind the doing, effecting becoming. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything." What Nietzsche meant was revolutionary. There is no abstract self or soul separate from the body that can or should control it. The body's instincts, emotions, and desires aren't foreign invaders to be controlled by a separate self. They are the very fabric of selfhood. The conventional moral perspective that sets up reason against passion, self against desire, is based on a fictional division within human nature. His personal library, which has been preserved, reveals how deeply he researched physiology, medicine, and the emerging science of evolution. His marginalia shows his growing conviction that morality should be understood not as metaphysics, but as a kind of physiology, an expression of bodily conditions rather than transcendent truths. Nietzsche found further evidence for his theory in the historical development of moral concepts. Through etymological analysis, he demonstrated how terms for good in various Indo-European languages originally meant noble, powerful, beautiful, qualities celebrating natural excellence. Only later were these terms reinterpreted to mean obedient, selfless, or controlled. This linguistic shift revealed a historical transition from moralities that affirmed natural vitality to those that constrained it. Perhaps most compellingly, Nietzsche examined the lives and works of those rare individuals throughout history who seemed to access and express natural wisdom. Artists, composers, dancers, certain philosophers. What distinguished them wasn't greater rational control over their instincts, but rather a more harmonious relationship with them. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he presents this insight through his prophet's words. The body is a great intelligence, a multiplicity with one sense, a war and a peace, a herd and a shepherd. Has there been a moment in your life when your body knew something your mind didn't yet understand? When you felt an inexplicable pull toward or away from something that later proved to be exactly right? As Nietzsche deepened his investigation, he identified a critical historical moment when the Western attitude toward instinct underwent a profound shift. In the Genealogy of Morals, he labels this transformation the slave revolt in morality, a radical revaluation of natural values that began in ancient Judea and reached its fullest expression in Christianity. What exactly was this revaluation? Before it, cultures across the world, from ancient Greece to Rome to pre-Christian Germanic and Celtic societies, maintained moral frameworks that largely affirmed natural instinct. Power, health, vitality, passion, and self-affirmation were celebrated as good, while weakness, sickness, and self-negation were viewed as bad. These weren't abstract moral theories, but practical affirmations of life's natural flourishing. The revolution occurred when a new moral framework inverted these values. Suddenly, selflessness was elevated over self-affirmation, meekness over strength, self-denial over natural desire. Nietzsche describes this as the most spiritual revenge, a conceptual revolution through which those who couldn't express natural vitality reinterpreted this inability as moral superiority. What's striking in Nietzsche's analysis is his insistence that this inversion wasn't merely a philosophical error. It was a specific response to particular physiological and historical conditions. In periods of cultural decline, among populations suffering from exhaustion, malnutrition, or chronic illness, instinct often becomes erratic and unreliable. Under such conditions, frameworks that constrain instinct can appear life-saving rather than life-denying. The historical evidence for this pattern is compelling. Nietzsche notes that ascetic moralities, those most hostile to natural desire, typically gain prominence during periods of societal stress, environmental pressure, or in the aftermath of war and disease. They represent adaptive responses to specific conditions rather than universal truths. This insight led Nietzsche to a nuanced position that's often misunderstood. He wasn't advocating for unreflective indulgence of every impulse. Rather, he recognized that different physical constitutions require different relationships to instinct. For some, greater constraint might indeed be necessary. His criticism was directed at the universalization of anti-instinct morality, the presumption that all human beings should distrust and suppress their natural inclinations. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche articulates this position. There is no formula for how much a spirit needs for its nourishment, but if its taste is for independence, for quick coming and going, for roaming, perhaps for adventures for which only the swiftest are a match, it is better off with little than with much. Different natures thrive under different conditions. What nourishes one person may poison another. Nietzsche's journals from his middle period show him meticulously tracking his own physical responses to environments, foods, social interactions, and intellectual activities. He discovered that his productivity and well-being varied dramatically based on climate, altitude, diet, and social context. Far from arbitrary preferences, these were specific wisdoms of his particular constitution. He came to see his previous attempts to override these signals, to live according to abstract principles of what a philosopher should do as the source of much of his suffering. This personal experiment informed his broader philosophical insight. What if health, for each individual, consists not in conforming to universal moral precepts, but in discovering and honoring the specific wisdom of one's own nature? What if virtue isn't control of instinct but attunement to it? The evidence for this alternative approach was hiding in plain sight. Nietzsche observed that those rare individuals who achieve extraordinary creative flourishing, the Goethes, Beethovens, and Napoleons of history, typically display not greater control of their instincts, but greater harmony with them. They don't suppress their nature, but refine and channel it. In your own experience, have you noticed how following external shoulds often leads to resistance and exhaustion, while aligning with your genuine inclinations can produce states of flow and fulfillment? Could this pattern be revealing something fundamental about human flourishing? As Nietzsche continued his investigation, a profound pattern began to emerge, one that connected individual health with cultural flourishing, physiological wisdom with philosophical truth. The pattern revealed something startling. Civilizations most hostile to instinct were also those displaying symptoms of biological and cultural decline. In The Antichrist, Nietzsche makes a bold claim. Every healthy morality is dominated by an instinct of life. Healthy cultures, he observed, don't teach their members to distrust their bodies, but to refine their instinctive responses. They recognize desire not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a force to be channeled. By contrast, declining civilizations characteristically invert this relationship, positioning instinct as dangerous and control as virtuous. Nietzsche found evidence for this pattern in comparative cultural studies of his time. Classical Greek culture at its height celebrated natural vitality in its art, philosophy, and social structures. The pre-Socratic philosophers, whom Nietzsche particularly admired, didn't oppose reason to instinct but saw reason as emerging from nature. Heraclitus, Thales, Empedocles. These thinkers created philosophies that affirmed natural processes rather than transcending them. The contrast with later periods was striking. As Greek civilization began its decline, philosophies emerged that increasingly positioned the body as an obstacle to truth rather than its vehicle. Plato's metaphysics, with its realm of perfect forms accessible only to the disembodied intellect, exemplified this shift. This wasn't coincidental timing. It reflected a broader cultural response to deteriorating conditions. Nietzsche traced this pattern through Roman civilization as well. Early Roman culture, with its emphasis on practical virtue, civic engagement, and natural excellence, displayed what he called the last great age of health in Europe. As political corruption, economic inequality, and environmental degradation increased, Romans became increasingly attracted to religions and philosophies that devalued instinct. First Stoicism, with its emphasis on emotional control, then ultimately Christianity with its more radical rejection of the flesh. What makes this pattern particularly revealing is that Nietzsche identified the same dynamics in microcosm within individual lives. People tend to trust their instincts when they're physically healthy, well-nourished, and in supportive environments. It's precisely when we're exhausted, malnourished, or under chronic stress that our instincts become erratic and our need for external controls increases. This insight led Nietzsche to a revolutionary conclusion. The war against instinct isn't a path to truth or virtue, but a symptom of decline. When life conditions deteriorate, instinct often becomes unreliable, and it's precisely then that philosophies and religions emerge that codify distrust of the body. These frameworks aren't advancing human understanding, but compensating for specific deficiencies. Nietzsche's personal letters reveal how this insight transformed his approach to his own health. Rather than battling his migraines, digestive issues, and visual problems through sheer willpower, as contemporary medical advice often suggested, he began to treat them as communications. His body was telling him something about what it needed: different foods, environments, rhythms of work and rest. As he learned to listen to rather than override these signals, his health gradually improved. This approach led to a profound philosophical reframing. What if health, both individual and cultural, consists not in controlling nature but in aligning with it. What if morality itself needs to be understood not as a system of constraints imposed on nature, but as an expression of natural flourishing? In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche articulates this vision. Once the soul looked contemptuously on the body, and then that contempt was the supreme thing. The soul wanted the body meager, ghastly and starved. Thus it thought to escape from the body and the earth. Now it is angry with happiness, and with anyone who doesn't need anger. Now it wants to wreak revenge, and even your virtues want to wreak revenge for your happiness. Have you noticed how the moments when you trust your instincts are often your moments of greatest health and clarity, while periods of self-doubt and internal conflict often coincide with stress, fatigue, or illness? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery extend far beyond philosophy. If he's right that instinct carries wisdom that rational thought often misses, that our bodies know things our conscious minds don't, then many of our fundamental assumptions about education, psychology, medicine, and ethics require radical reconsideration. Consider how we educate children. Traditional education focuses almost exclusively on rational, analytical thinking while treating bodily experiences as distractions. Children are taught to sit still, to suppress movement, to override hunger, fatigue, and the need for play in service of abstract learning. What if this approach fundamentally misunderstands how humans learn? Nietzsche suggests that genuine understanding isn't just cognitive but embodied. It involves the integration of instinct and intellect, not the supremacy of one over the other. Modern research in educational psychology increasingly supports this view. Studies show that movement enhances learning, that emotional engagement is essential for memory formation, that periods of play and rest are not luxuries, but necessities for cognitive development. What Nietzsche intuited through philosophical insight, contemporary science is confirming through empirical research. The implications for psychology are equally profound. The dominant therapeutic approaches of Nietzsche's time, and many that persist today, treat emotional distress as a problem of insufficient rational control. Uncomfortable feelings like anger, desire, grief, or fear are seen as disturbances to be managed rather than communications to be understood. But what if these emotions are carrying essential information? What if psychological health consists not in controlling these responses, but in developing a more nuanced relationship to them? This is precisely what emerging therapeutic models like somatic experiencing and internal family systems suggest. These approaches don't try to override emotional responses through rational reframing, but instead help people develop greater awareness of and curiosity about their embodied experiences. The goal isn't control but integration, not silencing the body, but learning its language. In medicine too, Nietzsche's insights challenge conventional frameworks. Modern medicine excels at treating the body as a complex machine, intervening when systems malfunction. But it often struggles to recognize the body's inherent wisdom, the way symptoms can be meaningful communications rather than just mechanical failures. Chronic pain, digestive issues, immune dysregulation. These are increasingly understood not just as physical breakdowns, but as complex adaptive responses that may contain important information about what the organism needs. Nietzsche's personal health journals, particularly those from his time in Italy and France, document his growing recognition that many of his symptoms improved, not through fighting them, but through listening to them. His migraines, for instance, weren't just random neurological events, but reliable signals that certain environments, foods, or activities weren't compatible with his constitution. By treating these signals as information, rather than as enemies to be conquered, he developed a more sustainable relationship to his own health. Perhaps the most radical implications are ethical. If morality itself isn't a set of abstract principles to which nature must conform, but rather an expression of natural flourishing, then ethical development consists not in learning to override instinct, but in refining it. The virtuous person, in this view, isn't one who successfully suppresses desire, but one whose desires have themselves become wise. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche articulates this vision. One thing is needful: to give style to one's character, a great and rare art. It is practiced by those who survey all the strengths and weaknesses of their nature, and then fit them into an artistic plan until every one of them appears as art, and reason and even weaknesses delight the eye. This doesn't mean uncritically following every impulse. Rather, it suggests a process of maturation through which instinct itself becomes more discerning. Just as a master musician doesn't need to consciously control every finger movement, but has developed an embodied intelligence that guides technical execution, the person of refined character doesn't need to consciously control desires, because the desires themselves have been cultivated. Have you experienced moments when following a seemingly irrational instinct led to unexpected wisdom or growth? What might your life look like if you approached your desires not as enemies to be conquered, but as allies to be understood? The question naturally arises. If instinct carries such wisdom, why has Western culture so consistently taught us to distrust it? Nietzsche's answer is provocative. The war against instinct isn't just a philosophical error, but a deliberate strategy of social control. In On the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche examines how religious institutions, political structures, and educational systems have historically benefited from teaching people to distrust their natural inclinations. A person connected to their embodied wisdom is inherently less controllable. They have an internal compass that may contradict external authorities. By contrast, someone trained to distrust their instincts becomes dependent on external guidance, making them easier to influence and direct. The evidence for this pattern appears throughout history. Religious institutions have consistently positioned themselves as necessary intermediaries between people and their own experience, claiming special authority to interpret which desires are good or evil. Political systems have benefited from citizens who question their own perceptions and defer to official narratives. Economic structures profit from consumers who can't distinguish authentic needs from manufactured wants. This isn't necessarily the result of conscious conspiracy. Rather, systems that encourage self-distrust naturally tend to perpetuate themselves because they create dependent subjects. Those who learn to override their instincts become reliant on external validation and instruction. They look outside themselves for answers to the most basic questions. What should I want? What should I fear? What should I believe? Nietzsche's personal letters reveal his growing awareness of how his own education had taught him this self-distrust. His rigorous German schooling had trained him to value abstract knowledge over embodied wisdom, to trust books more than experience, to pride himself on his ability to override natural inclinations in service of academic achievement. It was only through his health crisis, when this approach literally began to break down his body, that he recognized the cost of this disconnection. What makes this pattern particularly insidious is how it becomes self-perpetuating. Once we learn to distrust our instincts, we become increasingly unable to access their wisdom. Desires that might otherwise guide us naturally become distorted through suppression and judgment. We create the very anarchy of instinct that then seems to justify greater control. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Teach people that their desires are dangerous, and those desires will indeed become problematic through repression and eventual eruption. Nietzsche identified this dynamic in the moral psychology of Christianity, which he believed created the very sinfulness it claimed to cure. By teaching people that natural desires are sinful, Christianity establishes an impossible standard of self-control, ensuring that most people will experience themselves as moral failures in need of redemption. This psychological dependence serves institutional interests perfectly. It creates the conditions for its own necessity. The same pattern appears in modern contexts. Consider how contemporary wellness culture often positions the body as a problem to be fixed rather than a source of wisdom to be heard. Dieting, fitness regimens, meditation practices, many of these are marketed not as ways to connect with embodied wisdom, but as techniques to control bodily impulses deemed problematic. Even approaches that claim to be natural often actually involve imposing abstract ideals on bodily experience. This critical insight led Nietzsche to recognize that genuine liberation isn't just about changing belief systems, but about recovering trust in one's own nature. In Ecce Homo, he describes his own journey. To become what one is, one must not have the faintest notion what one is. The whole surface of consciousness is a surface, must be kept clear of all great imperatives. Beware even of every great word, every great attitude. So many dangers that the instinct comes too soon to understand itself. What Nietzsche is describing is the subtle process through which we can begin to reconnect with instinctive wisdom without immediately filtering it through conceptual frameworks that distort it. This requires a period of suspension, letting go of shoulds and musts, long enough to rediscover what our nature actually wants. Have you noticed how many of your personal preferences actually reflect social conditioning rather than authentic desire? What spaces in your life allow you to reconnect with what you genuinely want, free from external expectations? If Nietzsche's insight about instinctive wisdom is so profound, why isn't it common knowledge? Why don't our educational systems teach us to trust and refine our natural inclinations rather than override them? The answers reveal how deeply entrenched the mistrust of nature has become in Western culture, and how threatening Nietzsche's alternative vision remains to established power structures. Nietzsche identified three primary reasons why his revaluation of instinct has been consistently sidelined, misrepresented, or actively suppressed. First, it fundamentally threatens existing religious frameworks. Christianity in particular has historically positioned the flesh as the primary obstacle to spiritual development. Paul's letters repeatedly contrast the spirit with the flesh, identifying natural desires as the enemy of salvation. A philosophy that positions these same natural inclinations as potential sources of wisdom directly undermines this core theological premise. Nietzsche's critique wasn't limited to Christianity. He saw similar patterns in other major religious traditions, particularly those that emerged during what Karl Jaspers would later call the Axial Age, a period between approximately 800 and 200 BCE, when religious and philosophical systems emphasizing transcendence over immanence gained prominence across multiple civilizations. These traditions consistently positioned the body and its desires as obstacles to higher consciousness rather than vehicles for it. The second reason involves political implications. Nietzsche recognized that people connected to their embodied wisdom are inherently more difficult to control through external authority. They have an internal reference point that may contradict official narratives. By contrast, those trained to distrust their own perceptions and desires become dependent on external guidance. They look to authorities to tell them what to want, what to avoid, what to value. This insight appears repeatedly in Nietzsche's notebooks from the 1880s, where he analyzes how political systems benefit from what he calls the internalization of man, the process through which natural drives are turned inward and transformed into self-suppression. A person engaged in constant inner conflict has little energy for questioning external power structures. Self-suspicion becomes a form of political compliance. The third, and perhaps most subtle reason, involves professional interests. The very concept of expertise in fields like ethics, psychology, and education is built on the assumption that people cannot trust their own nature, that they need external guidance to flourish. A philosophy suggesting that wisdom might be accessible through refined instinct rather than abstract knowledge threatens the authority of those whose status depends on providing this guidance. Nietzsche experienced this professional resistance firsthand. His early works were largely ignored by the academic establishment, and when they did receive attention, they were often misrepresented as promoting crude hedonism or irrationalism. The nuance of his position, that instinct could itself become refined and discerning, was consistently overlooked in favor of caricatures that were easier to dismiss. This pattern of misrepresentation has continued long after Nietzsche's death. His philosophy is frequently reduced to simplistic slogans like "God is dead" or "will to power," stripped of context and subtlety. His critique of morality is portrayed as a rejection of all values, rather than a call for more natural ones. His affirmation of instinct is characterized as mindless indulgence rather than the cultivation of embodied wisdom. Perhaps most tellingly, Nietzsche's insights about the body's intelligence have been systematically separated from his broader philosophical project. Academic philosophy has largely treated his comments on physiology and instinct as colorful metaphors rather than central insights. This compartmentalization preserves the traditional philosophical assumption that truth is accessed through pure reason, not embodied experience. Even in contexts where Nietzsche's ideas have gained recognition, they're often domesticated by being assimilated into frameworks that preserve the basic distrust of nature. His insights about the body's wisdom are reframed as techniques for better self-control, rather than alternatives to control itself. His critique of morality becomes merely another moral system rather than a fundamental revaluation of what morality means. What makes this resistance particularly ironic is that modern research increasingly supports Nietzsche's intuitions about embodied wisdom. Studies in cognitive science, neurobiology, and psychology consistently demonstrate that emotional and physical responses contain essential information that conscious reasoning alone can't access. The body does indeed know things that the conscious mind might miss. Have you noticed how institutions and authorities often discourage you from trusting your own perceptions and feelings? How systems of expertise position themselves as more reliable than your direct experience? What might be gained by reclaiming trust in your embodied wisdom? The final question isn't whether instinct contains wisdom. The evidence increasingly suggests it does. The question is what it might mean to reclaim this wisdom in a culture that has systematically taught us to distrust it. What would a life guided by refined instinct, rather than abstract morality, actually look like? And how might we begin to recover the natural intelligence our bodies already contain? Nietzsche's answer is both radical and subtle. It isn't about abandoning conscious thought for blind impulse. Rather, it involves developing a new relationship between instinct and awareness. One where consciousness serves not as the master of instinct, but as its listener and interpreter. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he expresses this through his prophet's words. There is more reason in your body than in your best wisdom. This approach doesn't mean uncritically following every desire. It means learning to distinguish between the authentic voice of instinct and the distorted expressions that emerge from suppression and judgment. Just as a skilled musician doesn't play every note that comes to mind but develops an ear for which combinations create harmony, the person of refined instinct doesn't act on every impulse but cultivates discernment about which inclinations lead to flourishing. Nietzsche called this process giving style to one's character, the art of shaping natural inclinations without denying their fundamental wisdom. It's neither rigid control nor formless indulgence, but a dynamic dance between instinct and awareness, nature and culture, spontaneity and form. What might this look like in practice? Nietzsche offers clues throughout his work. It begins with periods of what he calls the great silence, intervals where we temporarily suspend judgment about what we should want in order to rediscover what we actually do want. This isn't easy in a culture saturated with voices telling us what to desire, value, and pursue. It requires creating spaces of genuine attentiveness to our embodied responses. From this foundation, we can begin to notice patterns in our natural inclinations. Which desires, when followed, lead to greater vitality and connection? Which ones, despite promising immediate pleasure, ultimately diminish our capacity for joy? This isn't about imposing abstract moral judgments, but about learning from experience itself, allowing nature to educate nature. Gradually, this process leads to what Nietzsche calls the innocence of becoming, a state where we no longer experience our desires as foreign invaders to be controlled, but as integral aspects of selfhood to be understood. The war between self and desire reveals itself as an artificial division within human nature, a conceptual error rather than a necessary conflict. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. Nietzsche compares it to learning a new language or mastering a musical instrument. It requires practice, patience, and the willingness to make mistakes. There will be periods of confusion as we unlearn habitual self-distrust, and moments of excess as we experiment with greater self-permission. These aren't failures, but necessary stages in reclaiming our natural wisdom. If you found yourself nodding along with these ideas, perhaps you're already engaged in this process. Perhaps you've noticed how moments of trusting your instincts have led to unexpected growth, connection, or insight. Perhaps you've experienced the relief that comes from dropping the exhausting effort of constant self-control and discovering that your nature, left to its own intelligence, often knows exactly what it needs. You're not alone in this recognition. A growing community of people is rediscovering what Nietzsche identified over a century ago, that the body isn't the enemy of wisdom, but its foundation, that desire isn't something to overcome but something to refine, That instinct carries intelligence that rational thought alone can't access. If this perspective resonates with you, consider this an invitation to continue the exploration. Notice moments when your body seems to know something your mind doesn't yet understand. Pay attention to which desires, when followed, lead to greater vitality, and which ones lead to depletion. Experiment with trusting your natural responses rather than immediately judging them. And if you found value in this philosophical investigation, consider sharing it with others who might benefit. Leave a like as a signal that conversations about philosophical ideas still matter in our rushed world. Subscribe to continue this journey of inquiry, where we examine the assumptions that shape our lives without our conscious awareness. And most importantly, share your own experiences in the comments. How have you witnessed the wisdom of instinct in your life? When has your body known something before your mind could articulate it? As Nietzsche wrote in The Gay Science, what is required is a new justice and a new watchword and new philosophers. The moral earth too is round. The moral earth too has its antipodes. The antipodes too have their right to exist. There is another world to discover, and more than one. Embark, philosophers. Have you already begun to discover this other world? The world where instinct isn't the enemy of wisdom, but its foundation.